You can shift your microbiome within 1 day. If you have a healthy gut, you have a healthy brain. There's no such thing as junk food. There's junk and then there's food. You can see where people are holding their fat. It's in the gut area, gas, bloating, constipation, irritable bowel. And so you just feed those particular types of bacteria, and then you have a lack of diversity in the microbiome. And those bacteria interact with our own DNA. It's extremely scary. Hyperbarics can kind of help whatever you're doing to kill that infection work better.
Welcome back to How to Hyperbaric podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Masha, and today I have with me Dr. Anju Usman Singh. She's an MD, medical doctor who specializes in many things really, but Dr. Usman is known for her work in community of special needs kids. She runs the True Health Medical Center in Chicago and has an amazing supplement company. I've tried those supplements and will mention some of them during this interview. It's called True Healing Naturals. And today we're planning to talk about gut health and how it affects our overall health and how hyperbaric therapy can help us improve gut health in different conditions. Welcome to the show, Anju. I'm very excited to have you with me today.
I'm so excited to be here and talk to you.
I know you're busy, so thank you for giving me this time on, I think, your only day off, really. But it is important. When I went to naturopathic school, I think when we just started, we had this old naturopathic doctor who gave us an introductory lecture. And he said that in naturopathic world, you either treat the gut first or the liver. There's no other way, because if you don't optimize gut or liver, everything else that you do is only going to have a marginal effect. Do you agree with that statement?
I 100% agree with that statement. I remember when I was a kid and I went to India when I was like 8 years old, and people were talking about their poop. And I thought, that's so weird because in the United States, nobody talks about their bowel movements at all. And it was so common in other countries to kind of say, you know, did you have a bowel movement today? Or what was the consistency? And I just thought, that's kind of strange. And even in China, when I went to China, one of the sayings is, how is your liver? Instead of like, how are you doing today? They would say, how is your liver? I work, like you said, I work with children mostly. And most of my patient clientele over the years have been children with developmental disorders like autism. And the more I work with this whole idea of the gut brain connection and even the gut body connection, they say that the gut is your first brain. And so a lot of the connections and a lot of what happens in our body is really related to our gut health.
For our listeners, when we're just a little embryo inside our mother's womb, gut tissue and brain tissue develop sort of from the same kind of cells, and they stay connected for the rest of our lives. And what I learned as an adult, actually, when I was learning about hyperbaric therapy, that if somebody has a concussion, it will ultimately affect their bowel movements. A lot of times they'll become constipated. They'll start having some sort of problems in the area of their gut, even though they had a concussion in their head.
I think people think that gut talks to the brain, but the brain talks to the gut too, like you're mentioning. So it's a bi-directional flow. So I always say, if you have a healthy gut, you have a healthy brain. And if you have a healthy brain, you have a healthy gut. So if you have like mental illness, like anxiety, depression, mood issues, bipolar, there's really a lot going on in your gut that you may not realize that's affecting your brain. And if you have GI issues like gas, bloating, constipation, irritable bowel, then you may have symptoms of anxiety and mood issues, but the key to those is your gut and
And
not SSRIs or anti-anxiety drugs.
let's start with talking how we developed those gut issues. Why all of a sudden I might have a problem with my intestinal health or the health of my stomach and all this area of my body.
No, that's a great question. The etiology of gut issues, it's probably multifactorial. Probably in my head, the number one problem is antibiotics.
Mhm.
And we get antibiotics. Some of our moms got antibiotics at the delivery. You know, some of our moms got antibiotics during their pregnancy, and that affected their microbiome. So when the baby comes out, it's supposed to get our mother's microbiome. So if the mom's microbiome isn't great, then the child's microbiome or gut bacteria aren't going to be optimal. And then we find antibiotics in our water supply. We find antibiotics in our food supply. So even if we're not taking an antibiotic, we're getting exposed to them just by, eating meat because they give animals antibiotics. And so then if we get an illness and we take an antibiotic for that illness, then it not only kills the bacteria that caused the illness, but it also kills the good bacteria in our gut. And
Mhm.
then we're left with a disrupted gut flora or a disrupted gut microbiome. And what we see as a byproduct of that disruption is decrease in our good bacteria, like lactobacillus and bifido, and an increase in bad bacteria, like Clostridia and overgrowth of yeast and fungus. So that's a huge common potential problem that I see, antibiotics. And probably the number two would be diet, just eating foods that are perpetuating certain bacteria. And so what happens if, say, you have a very meat-based diet, then you start feeding certain bacteria in your gut. Even though they're good bacteria, they overgrow. And so you just feed those particular types of bacteria, and then you have a lack of diversity in the microbiome. And that diverse microbiome signals different cells in your brain, like GABA receptors that help with calming and other receptors. And so the key to, I think, the key to overall health, and I'll say this with confidence, the key to overall health, because the gut not just affects our brain, our cardiac system, our skin, our digestive system, our hormonal system, blood sugar, so many things I can go into it. But the key to overall health is a diverse microbiome.
Can I add number three to that? Stress.
Mm-hmm. Oh God.
I think
Mm-hmm.
stress is huge because sometimes people will say, oh, but I never received antibiotics. And there are people out there who actually never took antibiotics.
Right.
Their diet could be diverse. I can't say pretty good, but at least diverse. But they're experiencing such a high level of stress, or they had a very stressful event. And if we think about this bacteria, there are and viruses and fungi that live in our gut. They're alive. So if we're affected by stress, that they're probably also
Mm-hmm.
affected by stress. So these things definitely contribute. But somebody might say, so I have dysbiosis, which means microbiome is not what it's supposed to be for somebody to be healthy. So what? In what kind of issues can that translate?
Yeah, so we were kind of alluding to some of that. So obviously, if you have an abnormal microbiome and you have, say, an overgrowth of certain types of yeast, so if you have like overgrowth of Candida, for instance, it may translate as I have a foggy brain.
Mm,
Um, I can't concentrate. I can't focus. I have ADD symptoms. In other people, the abnormal microbiome may lead to low levels of a bacteria called Akkermansia. And if
mhm,
you have low levels of Akkermansia, that can lead to blood sugar dysregulation and prediabetes and weight gain. If you have an imbalance between certain bacteria called Bacteroides and Firmicutes, that leads to obesity. So there's just, I can't even like answer that question. All I can say is an abnormal microbiome can lead to brain issues, like we discussed. It can lead to cardiac problems. It can lead to diabetes and hormonal issues. It can lead to cancer even later on in life. It can lead to allergic type issues. Autoimmune issues are huge with the abnormal microbiome. I was listening to a podcast about dermatology and premature wrinkling and just premature aging of our skin associated with an abnormal microbiome. So, pretty much any chronic issue that you're dealing with, I would say the key to it is a healthy microbiome, at least a piece of that key, because that is kind of the foundation of the other things that are going on.
So can we say, maybe we can't, I don't know. I mean, I'm just thinking, every health condition, at least part of its picture is disrupted microbiome.
Yeah, yeah.
And if we correct that part, we would see an overall improvement. You mentioned obesity or blood sugar dysregulation. It's an epidemic. I don't know. Everybody is concerned with that. So does it mean that if we work on people's microbiome, we can actually help them a lot in that area?
Oh, yeah, there's been studies on that actually. Your audience has probably heard about fecal transplants,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so they've done these studies in people with Clostridia overgrowth or C. diff, Clostridia difficile, where they can't get rid of it. They just can't get rid of it. And C. diff causes a variety of health issues and mental issues. It affects dopamine metabolism. But one of the treatments for it is fecal transplant. And it's 99% effective in Clostridia difficile to like completely eradicate this when they can't use anything else. But what they found is if they picked the wrong donor, some of the people who were skinny became fat, and some of the people who were fat became skinny.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's really interesting to think that the type of bacteria in your gut help you obviously metabolize fats, metabolize sugars better, and absorb and digest your food the way you need to so you can stay healthy and have a good metabolic rate. And other bacteria may slow it down.
So, somebody who is desperately trying to lose weight, who understands that they have this issue and they've looked into what they eat and how they move, but they don't see the scale moving. Next step would definitely be look into their microbiome.
Yeah, yeah. And there's new types of testing available now too. Before we would just look at like say, in a petri dish, we would look culture and
Mm-hmm.
say, oh yeah, these are the bacteria that's growing. And then they did that whole like human genome study where
Mm-hmm.
they were able to figure out the genes in our body. But then they started working on the human microbiome. And they found that it was like a 1 to 1,000. There was more DNA in our microbiome than we have DNA in our body. And those bacteria interact with our own DNA. So now they can do DNA studies of the microbiome. And they've taken it another level. Now they can do RNA. And
Mm-hmm.
so RNA is what's transcribed from the DNA. You can have DNA and not express some DNA.
Mm-hmm.
Like I could have the gene for a peanut allergy, and I don't have a peanut allergy, but my daughter does, right? So just to have the DNA of something doesn't mean you have it. But when you measure the RNA, you're actually measuring what's being transcribed. And so
So,
now they can look at the RNA in a small sample of your stool and give you the whole map of your whole microbiome. And you can see the areas that you're low in, the areas that you're high in, the areas that are too much, too little. And there's really studies to show like, okay, if you have this ratio off, then this probiotic or prebiotic will help.
mm-hmm.
Or if you have overgrowth of, say you have overgrowth of, we'll use Clostridia again because it's a common one. if you have overgrowth of Clostridia, then something simple as cinnamon can help. So if you know what's happening in your body, and cinnamon helps with blood sugar regulation. So, if you know what's going to happen in your body, this is called individualized medicine, right? Like this is
Mm-hmm.
individualized instead of saying, oh, here's a supplement to lose weight. I mean, that may or may not work for you.
Like with everything else, people always say, okay, what's the protocol for this and what's the protocol for that? There's no protocol for this or for that. There's a protocol for John or Mary or another person who comes in and wants to get better. You precluded my next question. So let's say somebody has a health issue and they looked into different factors that could be contributing. And after listening to this podcast or maybe another podcast, because people are really trying to bring attention in the medical community to the importance of microbiome for so many years now. And they've realized, okay, maybe microbiome is an issue because it is really an issue in all of us.
Hmm.
I should also say it's not something that you fix once and for all. It's always fixing microbiome as long as you live because it's a living entity. So they realized it and they did the testing, the new testing that you just described. And that testing shows that something's off. What is the next step?
Yeah, so I would say, as you mentioned, it's a process.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that what we put into our bodies is a huge piece of healing. And a lot of the times we don't realize what we're putting in. Even if we're eating healthy, I know for me, I want to eat more fruits and vegetables for my microbiome. I want to eat less carbohydrates and less processed food. But yet, when I go to the store, my okra is packaged in plastic. My zucchini is in a plastic container. My nuts and seeds are all packaged. So even though I'm eating healthy, I'm getting all these chemicals and microplastics in my gut. I find it really difficult to eat a really clean diet. I grow my own herbs and I make my own spices and I try not to buy packaged things as much as possible. But it's very difficult in this day and age. We don't live in the same kind of environment that our grandparents lived in, where we could just get food off the farm and eat farm to table. And so I do think that the first step is like we use the word clean, but
Mm-hmm.
avoiding eating organic foods, eating meats and eggs and animal products that are not fed antibiotics and hormones, so that are farm raised and grass fed. That's a big one. Staying away from refined sugars and refined carbohydrates and eating whole grains, going more to a plant-based diet. They say that you can shift your microbiome within one day. Within one day, you can make a change because you know how you feel if you just ate crappy food that day. You know how you feel if you just ate some donuts and cookies or McDonald's or, whatever, Coca-Cola. You start to bloat, you get gassy, you don't feel good, you have brain fog, like literally it's instantaneous. So when they did studies on cleaning up the diet in these ways, they were able to balance the microbiome within days, within days. So it takes a little bit of effort to start shifting how you think about food. Dr. Nuanchwander, I'm involved in a group called MAPS, Medical Academy for Pediatric Special Needs. And I've been involved in this world of integrative medicine for children for over 30 years. And we say there's no such thing as junk food. There's junk and then there's food.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good saying.
There's no junk food because that's not food.
Exactly.
And again, we call it SAD diet, the standard American diet. And it's scary. You see little babies, you see little children, and you look at what they're eating, and it's extremely scary. And young women aren't cooking. In our culture, young people aren't cooking, and they've kind of lost the art. So I think that the biggest help is diet and a clean, healthy, good fats, not oxidized, not fried, trans fats, things like that are also detrimental to the gut microbiome. I think that people don't realize how chemicals are so disruptive from a diet perspective.
They also
As
accumulate. So there's a cumulative effect. Maybe if we were exposed just to one chemical once a day, our bodies could deal with it. But because we're constantly bombarded with this,
yeah,
so our defenses are, we don't have such resources. I don't think we were designed
to
that
handle.
way. And we
They're
can with
called, yeah, they're called persistent organic pollutants or everlasting chemicals. And I think this whole kind of epidemic of obesity and weight gain, and you can see where people are holding their fat. It's in the gut area. So where do these chemicals that you just said we can't get rid of them, where do they go? Well, they hide in fat. And
Mhm.
our body tries to protect ourselves, and it almost is like accumulating fat to protect our body from these chemicals. It's kind of like a little, pocket of protection. And it really is, like people say, oh, decrease your carbs, decrease your sugars. And I would say, decrease your chemicals, your makeup, everything you put on your body. So clean air, clean water, clean food, cleaning agents, soap, shampoos, detergents, Teflon, fluoride, anything you can think of.
These things need to be taught in school. There should be a subject, how to stay healthy in a world that we live in.
Hmm.
To teach, these are your chemicals that you're exposed to. This is how you can minimize the exposure. This is how you can improve detoxification. So at the end of the schooling, we get out people who not only proficient in math, biology, and literature, but also know those things, how to stay healthy and how to cook. When I was a child growing up, we actually had a subject which was called cooking. I enjoyed it very much. So everybody had to bring something, like you bring eggs, you bring this, and that. And at the end, you make a meal and then you eat it together.
Plus, it's so much fun. Like, if you think about community and you talked about stress, I mean, obviously, we live these lives where we're on our social media and we're getting bombarded with all this information. And, oh, I got to do this and I'm scared of this. And I mean, even us talking, it creates fear, it creates stress. But if you think about community and how we de-stress, we need people, we need to be with people, we need to talk, we need to express ourselves in different ways. And eating and food is such a huge part of that. And just
Absolutely.
getting people together, like you said, just in class. And I mean, I feel sometimes like, oh, I just want to invite all my neighbors and everybody, okay, everybody pick something and let's do that here. But, it's not a concept that we have. We might have a party, but then it gets stressful
Then it gets
because we
stressful,
all have
yes,
to make
because you
sure
have a
that
lot
it's
of
good,
people.
be perfect.
Yes, I agree. It shouldn't be stressful. It should be absolutely fun and, supposed to make you feel better. I have a question. Yes, diet is super important. In my opinion, if we don't change the way we eat, everything else is really will have a very little effect. So first, always change your diet. But then you get certain population of patients, I think including children in special needs children with developmental disorders, where many interventions aimed at improving their gut health don't bring as much result as we hope for. Why does this happen?
So, we talked about diet, and then we may use other interventions like you mentioned. We might use digestive enzymes and probiotics and prebiotics and different herbs to kind of balance the microbiome. And we still might be like, what is going on? And I think in those cases of those kids with developmental issues, my thought process is that they have some type of immune issue where I'm having a really hard time healing that endothelial lining of the gut lining. So I'm still dealing with the leaky gut. Things are still getting into their system. They're still triggering and activating the immune system. And when the system is leaky like that, toxins enter and then they don't leave. So my children who I working on their gut, I'm not getting where I need to go to, then my next thought is, okay, there's something going on with toxicity and their system is just so overloaded that then I need to kind of physically work on cleaning them up to see if I can kind of again rebalance their immune system. And so we have to go to sometimes immune modulators and peptides and things like that to get the immune system to behave itself. But the number one is for my population for diet, it's a dairy-free, gluten-free, sugar-free diet helps 70% of our patients because those are the most inflammatory foods. And then excitotoxin free. We don't want to put foods that create inflammation in the brain and stimulate this receptor called glutamate that makes you anxious and excited. So MSG, NutraSweet, red and yellow food dyes, nitrites, sulfites, high fructose corn syrup, and caffeine. Those are like, besides a healthy diet, those are the no-nos for people with chronic immune or autoimmune conditions. It's a journey and it takes quite a bit of effort um,
And
I
discipline.
do and discipline. It's funny that the parents are willing to do it for the children, but they're not willing to do it for themselves.
Because it's things we do for love, and it's a completely different conversation. But I think women or men as well, parents, they love their children more than they love themselves. In this society, we're not taught self-love. So
Mhm.
I think it has to do with that. Something,
So yeah, I
absolutely.
tell my families, if you're gonna do it, I want your family to do it. I want your husband to do it and your wives. And if you're gonna do it for your child, like some people might be thinking, oh, I have a child with developmental delays, I want to kind of work on this for my child, but work on it for yourself too. It's a it,
100%. Andrew, where does hyperbaric come into the picture of all of that, gut health and everything we talked about today?
I'm kind of known for a protocol in improving gut health called a biofilm protocol.
Mm-hmm.
And without getting too fancy or technical, some people have chronic infections and we can't get rid of them. And what do? We throw antibiotics at them. But then what happens? It makes their gut health even worse. So
Mm-hmm.
we end up in this vicious cycle of trying to get rid of infection, making gut health worse, and then making the immune system worse. 70% of the immune system is in the gut. And so hyperbarics can kind of help with this concept that when we have a chronic infection, sometimes those infections have this mucus layer around them.
Mm-hmm.
And the immune system can't penetrate that mucus layer. And then we give antibiotics and it just solves the top. And we never get actually deep and kill like chronic UTI, urinary tract infection, or chronic sinusitis, or chronic otitis, or gingivitis, or periodontitis, or gastroenteritis, and Clostridia, things like that. So I think that I developed an enzyme called Mucosolve,
Mm-hmm.
and that helps to dissolve this mucus layer that's hiding these infections. But hyperbarics is an adjunctive treatment that can kind of help if you're on chronic antibiotics or have a chronic infection. Hyperbarics can kind of help penetrate those biofilms, help whatever you're doing to kill that infection work better. And so one of the indications for hyperbarics are these chronic infections like diabetic wounds or abscesses or, really deep infections that are really hard to clear. But even these like low level microbiome imbalances, they've shown that hyperbarics can help kind of balance that out as well by bringing oxygen to the tissue, helping kind of balance the microbiome, bringing blood flow and nutrition to where we need to go. And so I find it, a valuable adjunctive therapy to kind of bringing healing to people who have like chronic health issues, especially gut issues and chronic infections.
But what about candidiasis? If somebody has candida overgrowth and they're doing protocols with multiple hyperbaric sessions, does hyperbaric sort of promote candida growth?
Yeah, so again, just with everything, there's always a positive and a potential,
Mhm.
side effect. So we're talking oxygen, right? We're talking you're delivering oxygen under pressure and you're oxygenating things a little bit better. So some bacteria love oxygen.
Mhm.
hmm And so bacteria such as Streptococcus, some of these gram-positive bacteria, and Candida or yeast are what they call facultative. They like oxygen. So if you go in a chamber under oxygen, you already have overgrowth of these things, it could make those worse. So usually when I put my patients in hyperbaric chambers, I'll give them something to prevent yeast overgrowth
Mhm.
before they go in the chamber. So
With,
I'll give them
with,
something like Saccharomyces boulardii,
mhm.
hmm or
But you
some
give it
herb
on the same day,
right before they go in.
right before they go in.
hmm
With Candida, I understand because we have really good protocols for Candida overgrowth, and I think we could potentially use it at the same time as hyperbaric therapy and see if there's some synergy in there with sort of immune modulating effects of hyperbaric. But Streptococcus, you mentioned that one, and it's implicated in a lot of autoimmune conditions. So my thought is we suggest or we advise hyperbaric therapy as an adjunctive therapy in for people with autoimmune issues because it massively brings down inflammation.
Right.
But if streptococci infection was sort of a trigger point for their autoimmune condition, how does it all tie up?
Yeah, so Streptococcus does love oxygen. I've had a couple of cases where patients had gone in the chamber and then they had like a strep infection. And
Mm-hmm.
it's probably not they caught a strep infection, they already had it, and then they just got sick.
Reactivation. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Reactivation. I do have like a lot of patients with pandas and pans. And
Mm-hmm.
so infections are always kind of on the top of my list. So sometimes I will check like a strep, rapid strep, or I will do like an ASO titer, anti-streptolysin O titer. And if those titers are high, then I'm going to work on that before I would put them in the oxygen.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I might, again, give them something for strep simultaneously if I'm really worried about it. So again, I tend to use herbs. And so I'll use some herbs that can help with strep
Mm-hmm.
at the same time they're going in, just so that I'm not beating the potential bacteria.
And my
But
sort of last question with regarding HBOT and microbiome. Let's say somebody's doing 20 sessions or 30 sessions. This is one thing. But let's take a person who is doing hyperbarics for wellness and they're doing it almost all the time. So they jump into their chamber 3, 4 times a week. Aren't they promoting certain species that love oxygen? And would that in turn lead to disrupted microbiome or unbalanced? Because species that love oxygen will flourish.
and species that hate oxygen will die.
Mm-hmm.
I would look at that patient, and if they're flourishing in that chamber and they're doing well and they feel good, then they're creating the balance that they need for their bodies. But if I'm still dealing with chronic autoimmunity and we're still having issues and they're still thinking, oh, this is good for me, but they're not necessarily feeling better, then it may not be that great for them. And it's a fine line. And I don't think it's been studied because I've looked at the research on this, like the chronic use. The studies are in these like, 40 hours, high pressure for these infections, but like chronic use. But I think it's almost kind of like thinking about food. If you're eating the same kind of diet, then you're feeding the same kind of bugs. If you're giving the same kind of oxygen, then you're going to feed the same kind of bugs. But if that's good for you, then that works for you.
That's true, but it also brings us to maybe a realization that that's why breaks for somebody who's on a wellness protocol are necessary.
Yeah. Yeah.
everything a break, including microbiome, because maybe it's not supposed to be functioning at the higher levels of oxygen all the time.
And then the body will get used to things like that too. And
Mhm.
then some people live, in high altitudes,
Yes, and
right?
they do well. If you look at the population in the mountains, they're usually centenarians. They're the
Yeah.
ones who,
Yeah. So they're getting that extra push, right?
Mhm.
And they're the pressure
Yes,
and
and they're adapting.
their microbiome. It'd
Yeah,
be interesting to look at their microbiome versus, the valley
absolutely.
people
Yes.
microbiome just to see because they're getting kind of like a low pressure hyperbarics all the time. So I don't think we know the answers, but I like the concept of breaks because even pulsing,
Mm-hmm.
I have a supplement company and I tell my patients, I don't want you on my supplement all the time. I really don't. Like if you're going to work on biofilm, work on it for a little while. You don't have to constantly do these things, and you don't really need a multivitamin if you're eating healthy. And if you're going to take herbs for your microbiome, do low levels for a short period of time and then take a break. And then we might need to do it again. So
Mm-hmm.
I like that idea of breaks and I like the idea of pulsing. I like the idea of trialing things, giving your body a little while. There's that concept of hormesis. Hormesis is when you do something and you get a benefit, but then after a while, your body kind of adjusts to that, and then it doesn't give you the benefit anymore. But you remember that it helped you, but it no longer does. It's like intermittent fasting, like if you fast for a day periodically, that may be good. But if you constantly do it, your body kind of gets used to it and then not as effective.
Yes, because it's a stressor. So if a stressor becomes your life, you really adapt it, or you
Right.
don't. If the stressor is too much, then we start to break down. It's a very interesting conversation. I was thinking one podcast episode, five topics for studies to be done. Okay, we need to, it only illustrates the fact how much we don't know. And a lot of what we do is really intuition. And that's okay.
I love that. I love that you said that. I use that a lot. I tell my families that I want to go with your intuition a lot because your intuition is bringing something up in this moment that's important for me to hear. And so I've heard it and we will go with that. And I also talk about intention. And I think intention is more important than technique. So we
Mhm.
get it, we get so worried about, oh, am I doing this right? Is this the way? Is this the protocol? Is that? Put your intuition and put your intention and put your love into something, and the universe will bring you what you need. And that's more important than stressing out about it.
I agree. This is actually a beautiful way, I think, to end our podcast here because this is the take home message. A lot of it is about energy. Yes, there are protocols. Yes, there are things, take this, take that, and something else at the end. But really, putting your best intention, doing it with love, will bring a lot of results. And then bringing in science,
Mm,
knowing that. If you
mm,
think your microbiome is disrupted, do the testing. Go to a functional medicine practitioner. They'll be able to order that testing for you. Go to Dr. Usman, especially if it's a pediatric case, if it's a child that we talk about. Do
mm.
the testing and then develop a plan. So, what can we do to balance back this microbiome? Because these things can be fixed. Beautiful thing about the gut that it bounces back really quickly. As you said, in one day,
Right.
yes, you can change the
Yes.
microbiome.
You can change it for the worse or the better.
Yes. I will leave all the links to Dr. Usman's website and also the links for the supplement company because these are really good quality supplements and also formulated with science, knowing that these things go well together and work for certain conditions. And I should have said it at the beginning that you were on a podcast before So somebody who's interested in different protocols for a child with developmental disorders, there is another podcast that with Dr. Usman that I suggest that you listen to because there's a wealth of information there.
Thank you so much, Masha.
Thank you, Anju.
Thank you. And bless you all.